All right, folks, we are back with the muscle and strength training pyramid. And as you can see, just by doing this pyramid, I'm growing facial hair and my squats increased. So just talking about this stuff is anabolic, folks. So definitely, I'm sure watching it is as well. So right off the bat, let's recap where we've been and talk about what we're talking about here. So this is the muscle and strength training pyramid. It's a way to prioritize your thoughts about training and thus help you to choose the best training approach that will optimize those things in order of priority. So we've got the importance from least to most. Base of the pyramid is the most important. And then we have the overall theme that this is encompassed in, which is periodization, which is the organization of these things, of priorities to optimize performance and prevent burnout and injury. All right? So, before I recap what we've talked about already in levels 1 through 3, adherence, VIF, and progression, I want to give a quick shout out to Stas Chileyev, who is a 65-year-old man who came up to me during dinner last week and asked me some questions about supplementation. And I was just really taken aback and honored that he sought me out and asked some questions. And he said that he liked the pyramid. And I thought it was just really cool that we're reaching, multi-generational audiences here. And also I want to give a big shout out to him for deciding to start on endurance training at this late in life as kind of a new exercise choice. So he's doing cycling and swimming and maybe even will do a full triathlon. So 65 years young, Stas Chileyev. Thank you so much and hope you see this. All right, so that's the shout out. Let's get to the recap of what we talked about so far. So first level of the pyramid is adherence. We spoke about this basically saying that, hey, consistency is more important than perfection. So we want something that you can adhere to, something that you can enjoy, and that if you're chasing optimal, but you never actually quite are consistent, that's actually not optimal, all right? And it's all about finding out what works for you in terms of the grand scheme, big picture, managing life stress, and having an approach that you can stick to throughout your whole journey of training. All right, then second installment was VIF, volume, intensity, and frequency. We talked about all three and how they fit into the grand scheme and how you balance them to get a good program. So intensity, real quick and dirty version. Strength needs to be intensity specific. If you want to get stronger in low reps, you've got to do low reps, right? Hypertrophy intensity is less specific. So it doesn't need to be heavy to get stronger. It's about muscle growth, which means it needs to be heavy enough. And then you want to choose the loading range, which is easy to accumulate volume. So somewhere in that 6 to 12 rep ranges in that loading scheme is probably the most appropriate for the majority of your hypertrophy work. We also talked about Badillo, 2006, the study that found that doing more and more of your volume at really, really heavy loads, over 90% of 1 RM, didn't necessarily produce the best strength gains. And in fact, a more moderate approach where the middle range group of the total amount of reps they did being over 90% of 1 RM actually gained more strength than the group that did a lot of their work over 90% of 1 RM. So you can take intensity too far, all right? Then we talked about volume and how, yes, the more volume you do, the more practice you get with your lifts because strength is not just a product of muscle size, although bigger muscles can move bigger loads. It's also a skill that you have to develop specific to the movement, which we're going to talk about today, and neurological adaptations that help you activate and recruit that muscle. So, volume, more, yes, more practice, more training and stimulation of the muscle, so therefore more growth. However, you can do too much volume. And as we saw in Badillo, doing too much volume of high intensity ended up being counterproductive. And as we saw in the review by Wernbaum, doing more volume at a certain point plateaued and even started to decline the rate of cross-sectional area growth. Finally, we talked about frequency, that basically you can do too much in a single session, so your frequency should accommodate your volume. If you need to do a higher volume approach and you find a single session is beating you down, then you spread it out. And then we talked about the way to integrate them all and probably a good starting range for anywhere from being a novice to a late stage intermediate. And that was, in that Wernbaum recap, somewhere between 2 to 3 sessions per body part per week and 40 to 70 repetitions per body part. 40 to 70 repetitions per muscle group per session. So that's a big range. That's training each muscle group 2 to 3 times a week, anywhere from 80, that's 40 twice a week, up to 210 repetitions across a week. That's 3 sessions at 70. And that's just a starting place. And then you would build from there or reduce from there based on your training age and your needs. All right? And remember, the idea that you can do too much volume, so everyone was kind of just, I've gotten a lot of questions about, hey, I should just be doing the maximum that you recommended, or even more, because the most volume I can do that I can recover from means that I will be progressing as fast as possible. Well, the problem is it's very hard to gauge objectively, am I recovering from this volume? So you don't really know what your maximal recoverable volume is, because you can always physically do a little more volume. You can always do one more set of deadlifts for 1 rep with 135 pounds. And you won't really know if you're recovering or not. You'll be able to physically complete the volume, but does that mean it's optimal for progress? So I also provided kind of a step-by-step way of looking at a flow chart of when do I need to increase volume. So, am I stalled? Yes. Okay. What do I do? Am I recovering? This is a subjective decision. No. Okay. Deload. If progress happens again, great. If not, reduce volume. Okay. Am I recovered? Yes. Increase volume. Right? So, great way to figure it out. And then last week I talked about progression. And we talked about how you need to match the rate of trying to increase your strength to your training age. And we talked about some models to do that. We also talked about big picture periodization approaches to getting efficient progress with your training. We talked about tapers and deloads and how to do them. And we also talked about something else related to progression. Yes, we did. I can't remember what it is. I'm going to look at my notes. Oh yeah. And how to test yourself and see when it's time to modify your training if you are not progressing with both AMRAPs and 1RMs. Okay. Whew, 7 minutes in and we haven't even started talking about what I want to talk about. That's okay, because this is going to be relatively quick. So, that's the recap. Let's talk about exercise selection. Now again, this is a very difficult thing to order, because if I was to say this is the powerlifting pyramid, I could assume that everyone's going to be doing squat, bench, and deadlift, and put this, either very high or very low if I didn't assume they were doing squat, bench, and deadlift. Because specificity is a very important thing. Specificity means that you will get, in the context of exercise selection, means that you will get specific gains in specific movements. So that means if you were to do leg press, you would get stronger in leg press more than you get stronger in squats. And there are actually studies to show this. So the best way to get stronger on a specific movement is to train that specific movement. And there have been numerous studies, and I've got links to 4 studies, including reviews below, that talk about different joint angles, different velocities, closed chain versus open chain, and all a bunch of different kind of variables, and just the actual movement pattern itself that shows that when you get stronger, it is specific to the thing that you're getting stronger in. Okay? So, that means if you want to get better at a specific movement, you need to train that movement. So therefore, like I said, remember, when I was talking about volume, intensity, and frequency, if you're trying to get stronger on certain movements, probably half to 3/4 of your volume should come from those movements, and the rest would be accessory work. Okay? So, specific gains in specific movements, therefore, your primary approaches to training for strength should be the movements you want to get stronger in. For hypertrophy, it's a little bit different, and we'll talk about that in a moment. So, hypertrophy is not optimal during the learning phase. Okay, great study here that I've linked below, number 5, the 5th one down. This is looking at simple exercises versus more complex exercises. A leg press and a biceps curl. And in this study, they found that the bicep curl started creating hypertrophy in the biceps much earlier than the leg press started creating hypertrophy in the lower limbs in the time course of training. And they hypothesized this was because it takes longer to coordinate multiple muscles through a complex movement pattern. For example, a leg press or a squat, where you have to bend at you have to move through the range of motion at multiple joints and coordinate muscle groups to move the muscles together to complete the movement. That is more difficult than simply just doing arm flexion, right? So, during the learning phase, you are primarily you're primarily getting skill and neurological adaptations. And not until you've actually learned a skill and developed the neurological adaptations to complete that movement pattern and coordinate all your muscles will you be able to maximize and optimize hypertrophy. So this is the reason why you wouldn't want to just switch your exercises out all the time. This is why you don't actually want to confuse your muscles, because you will have to repeat that learning phase where hypertrophy is not optimal. So even if your goal is purely just hypertrophy, you want to become an expert with the movements you choose to get bigger with, okay? And you want to make sure that you don't have too much variation in exercises. However, you don't want to have a rigid adherence to a single movement, even if your goal is strength. Like I said, 50 to 75% is probably a good range for your volume to come from on the specific movements you're trying to get stronger on. A study came out, I believe, last year where they compared two groups. One group only did the Smith machine squat. The other group did this, well, there's a few groups, but two big divisions in exercise selection. Some of the groups did only Smith machine squats, and some of the groups did Smith machine squats, lunges, deadlift, and leg press. Okay? They found that in the group that only did squats, they actually, believe it or not, only did Smith machine squats, I want to point that out, they actually didn't get as much strength gain in a 1 rep max on the Smith machine squat as the group that did all of the movements. Now you're saying, hold on, what about this bullet point you just said, Eric? Well, in these studies, they're comparing doing only one movement and to only another movement, and saying, yes, if you were to only do squats in one group and only do leg press in the other, they wouldn't transfer to the other. But in this one, both groups are doing the Smith machine squats. Okay? So why is it that the rigid adherence to a single movement in this study actually was inferior to doing more volume with that one movement? Well, a couple things to think about here. This is a study of Smith machine squats. So it's a complex multi-joint movement, but it's not as complex as something like a free weight squat, where you actually can traverse the bar forward and backwards, right? Smith machine, that can't happen. You have less control or less ability to screw up the movement. That's a good way to think of it. So perhaps this would have been different if we'd had actual, free weight squats. Maybe, maybe not. However, another way to think of it is that the movement is the combination of a bunch of different joints and muscles coordinated together. And it may not necessarily be the best and most efficient way to train each one of those single muscle groups. So if you have, we'll use the analogy of a weak link in a chain. If you were to pull that chain, pull, it's going to break the weak link. So that means if there is a weak link in all of the things contributing to a movement, that is what's going to be limiting it. So perhaps by having at least some accessory work and other movements, you can ensure that you have some of those movements where that same weak link is not the same weak link. So you can train it, it can grow, and the end result may be that you can have a better performance on the main lift you care about. Okay? So rigid adherence to a single movement, not ideal for strength, but also not for hypertrophy. So in this study, they found the quadriceps as a whole, all four of the heads of it, grew the same, or the same magnitude, whether you were doing the 4 exercises or the 1 with the same volume. However, they found more uniform growth in the group that did the 4 movements. So there wasn't any specific head that grew more and one specific head that grew less. While when they only did squats, some heads of the quadriceps didn't optimally grow. So what we're saying here is that if you do a specific movement, you'll get specific hypertrophy. And if your goal is to get uniform symmetrical development and development in all the muscles you possibly can, if your goal is to be a bodybuilder or just pure for hypertrophy or for aesthetics, you want to have more variation in your movements. But not too much so that you're always constantly learning. Okay? So, it comes down to efficiency. All right? Compound versus isolation. Compound movements are great. Before we decided that the body was a cool thing to look at, we realized that it moved things. And instead of trying to isolate very specific muscle groups and try to make a very specific compartment of a specific muscle group grow, it may make more sense to simply use the movements that our body was designed to use through full ranges of motion and joint actions to train those muscle groups together. Compound movements basically do the work of multiple isolation movements all at once. That's why they're a compound movement, right? So in general, the bulk of your training should be compound movements so that you can actually complete your training in some timely fashion, all right? That's not to say that there's no place for isolation movements. However, the biggest money makers in your training should be compound movements. So that's why when you looked at last week's episode, I had stuff earlier in the workout like squats, deadlifts, overhead presses, rows, lat pull downs, bench presses, leg presses, etc. before I then got to the things like the curls, the calf raises, the hamstring curls, the leg extensions, etc. All right? So, also, for powerlifters, the compound movements are going to be the ones that you're actually trying to get stronger in. So this just goes right back to specific gains and specific movements. So for a bodybuilder, yeah, you probably want to have some isolation movements in there. For a powerlifter, you may want to have some of them as well. However, you're thinking more about how do I increase my overall goal of increasing my squat, bench, and deadlift? How do I work on the potential weak links in my chain? All right, so let's talk about weak points. Weak points. This can be a lift or a muscle. So there's a place for isolation / assistance movements. Let's talk about it from a hypertrophy perspective. Okay? Doing rows and pull downs, you may find that certain parts of your back you just don't seem to get as much growth as others, or your biceps may take over, right? You may find that during pressing, you get a lot of growth in your triceps and delts and not your pecs, or you just don't feel them very much. You may have to do things and choose assistance movements or variations of an exercise to find what gives you uniform growth. Okay? Great example, personally, when I first started doing rows, lat pull downs, and all my back work, I had a really tough time feeling the main compartment of my back, the latissimus dorsi, the one that spans broadly across my back from the lower part almost at the lumbar all the way up and attaches at the top of the back. I found that I did get a lot of teres major, just kind of right underneath my armpit. I got a lot of bicep, and I was also getting a lot of kind of mid-back from my rows. So I almost had this T-taper. And I had to do some specific things with my approach to lat pull-downs and rows about making sure I'm pulling towards my waist, using straps to get me less bicep activation, and actively thinking about the movement of my rib cage and scapula to get a better connection to the muscle I was trying to train. Once I was able to do that, then I got much more effective training out of my lat pull downs, rows, etc. Point being is that I was doing a compound movement and getting great development from it, but not everywhere that I needed it as a bodybuilder. I was getting great traps, or mid-traps at least, great rear delts, nice teres major, erectors, all that stuff were growing nicely for my training, but I was having a really tough time developing my lats, and it was hurting my V-taper on stage. So I had to do things with my exercise selection and performance to try to train that weak point. Okay, so that will be one of the reasons you will choose specific exercises as a bodybuilder. All right, but that should always come after the big ones that are going to be building the majority of your muscle mass. Okay. Now, for a power lifter, you may have a weak point in a lift. For example, you may be able to pull more with straps than you can with just chalk. That's a great indication that your grip strength is what's holding back your deadlift. Okay? So for example, you may find that it's a much more direct way to get from point A to point B of increasing your deadlift by directly attacking the weak length and doing grip strength training, where maybe you just do a static hold with a high percentage of your 1 rep max or over your 1 rep max and try to increase the time you can do it just out of the rack. Okay? Another example might be you're a low bar squatter and you get into a very exaggerated, because of your anthropometrics, the limb lengths and the shape of your body, into a pretty exaggerated kind of good morning look to your squat to get that bar over midfoot. And that's just the way you're going to squat doing it low bar. However, you find that you don't get great quad development. And the quads definitely contribute to a low bar squat, but not that much with not a whole lot of movement around the knee, right? So you might actually do a front squat or a leg press and go through a full range of motion, not just to meet depth, to try to get more quad development so that hopefully then when you do your squats, that extra leg development in the quads helps you move more weight. Okay? Same thing could be said for the bench press. Let's say, for example, that for whatever reason, the straight bar and the barbell bench press, doing a high frequency of it causes you shoulder pain or elbow pain. However, if you limit the frequency and volume of your bench press, you find you make slower progress. So you simply do the most you can do on the bench press knowing that it may not be the amount of frequency and volume you should do to avoid elbow and shoulder pain. However, you get more volume after the fact on a close grip bench press, on a military press, or even a dumbbell press. Okay? So great examples when the individual needs to decide, when do I need to do movements outside of the big three, for example, if I'm a power lifter. Okay? So, what's the big take home from all of this? Essentially, the movements you want to get stronger on should dominate your program. About half to three-fourths of your movements, if you're a strength-focused athlete, should be the movements you want to get stronger on. The other half to one-fourth should be your accessory movements. If your goal is hypertrophy, you still want to focus on the compound movements, the ones that are big bang for your buck, but you want to make sure that you have symmetrical development everywhere and that you're not neglecting anything. So you will have multiple compound movements, but not too many, so that you don't have to stay in the learning phase. Essentially, you need to be a little bit of a jack of all trades as a hypertrophy specialist or a bodybuilder, but still good at what you do, so that your neurological learning pattern isn't getting in the way of your muscle growth. While if you are a powerlifter or a strength athlete, you need to be a specialist who does some things that help him perform. Okay? So my recommendation would be, say, maybe 1 to 2 compound movements for each muscle group you want to train, and then 1 to 2 to 3 accessory movements for those muscle groups as well, if you're a hypertrophy specialist. And if you're a strength specialist, the prime mover, like so squat, bench, and deadlift, we'll use an example of a power lifter, and then 1, maybe 2 for bench and squat and deadlift kind of kept together. Okay? Maybe 3. Okay? Like I said, 50 to 75%. What that actually looks like on paper is going to be depending on your VIF. Right? Okay. So, don't want to take it too far. Don't rigidly adhere to a single movement. Taking specificity too far causes issues. That's why, and when you look at periodization theory, there's general prep and specific prep. Okay? There's a time and a place to maybe be doing only squats, say at a certain distance out from your competition, or only deadlifts or only bench. But you also have to think about all those things I brought up when I was talking about weak points. Okay? So, efficiency, yeah. Hammer the compounds primarily, use the isolations as needed, and then for your weak points, think about the movement selection that makes sense for what your weak points are on a lift or on a specific muscle group. All right? So that's it, folks. Check in next week for the next episode where we will talk about rest periods in the muscle and strength training pyramid.